And FYI, since I'm sharing my screen, I can't see the chat at all or the participant list. If you need anything, just try to text if you need anything.
We'll monitor that. All right, well, it is 10:34, so I will start now. So good morning, everyone. Looks like we have lots of people on the webinar already, 74. So that's my green light to go ahead and get started. So I'm Alejandro Huerta. If you don't know me yet, I'm the AHSC Program Director at Enterprise Community Partners. My peers at California Relief, Urban Echoes, and Climate Resolve will deliver the bulk of today's webinar presentation. But I'm going to give you a really quick AHSC 101 at the beginning. Before doing that, though, I want to thank you all again for attending today's webinar, which will give you the specifics on how to successfully incorporate urban greening, climate resiliency, and air pollution mitigation measures into your applications for the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Grant Program, which I like to refer to as AHSC. And let's also thank the State Strategic Growth Council for sponsoring today's webinar. And lastly, here are a few logistics. So you were all muted upon entry and also not allowed to show your videos. We are, of course. So if you have questions throughout this presentation, I encourage you to please enter them directly into the chat box, which is you see on the Zoom application is toward the bottom in the middle there. And we'll do our best to respond to these questions as they come up in the chat. But if we don't get to them, we will save time at the end of the presentation today to answer those questions that have been unanswered. And we'll also follow up in an email with the actual slides of the presentation, a link to the video recording, and a Q&A document. So with that, let's move on to the next slide. Great, thanks. So today's webinar is the last of 6 in our 2020 AHSC webinar series that you can see here listed on this slide. All the webinars have been recorded and will be on the SGC website. So if you didn't get a chance to listen to the earlier ones for whatever reasons, they'll all be on the SGC website for you to check out on your own time. Next slide. So let's do a really quick AHSC 101. AHSC, as you know, probably is one of many of California's cap and trade programs, or what we also refer to as a Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which receives its revenue from auctions held quarterly where pollution allowances are purchased. It's important to have this background in mind because at its core, the AHSC program is a Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, but it covers much more than that, including the topics we'll cover today. Next slide. Lastly, if you don't know, each year SGC, or the Strategic Growth Council, which oversees the AHSC program, contracts with technical assistance providers to offer focused technical assistance to qualified applicants throughout the state. Enterprise Community Partners and its subconsultants are the TA provider for this round of AHSC. As you can see from this slide, we have a robust team of subconsultant specialists that offer technical assistance throughout the state. This webinar in particular is being hosted by 2 of our TA team members, California Relief and Climate Resolve, who help the AHSC applicants with the urban greening, climate resiliency, and air pollution mitigation sections of the AHSC application and narrative. Okay, now let me hand it over to California Relief. Thank you, and I'll be here to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Alejandro, and thank everyone for coming here today. Again, I want to thank Enterprise for hosting this and Strategic Growth Council. It's really great to be able to be here with you all today, and of course, my partners at Climate Resolve to share with you over the next 45 minutes or so tips and techniques to maximize your score within the AHSC application as it relates to climate resiliency, air pollution, and urban greening. We've got a full agenda, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on just introductions, and we're gonna kind of dig right in. But I just wanted to give you this brief overview, and as Alejandro said, there will be opportunity for questions and answers at the end. So a little bit about my organization, California Relief. We work statewide with a network of nonprofits across California, approximately 100 groups engaged in urban forestry on the ground throughout California. This includes local conservation corps, nonprofit organizations, environmental justice groups, all committed to greening our golden state, as we like to put it. My job, I'm the Director of Public Policy and Grants within the realm of public policy. We work and advocate for funding for urban forestry and urban greening at the state capitol and improve policies surrounding these issues as well, all through the lens of climate change and environmental justice. My partner today, Colleen Rabden, the founder and CEO of Urban Ecos, has much experience in this field with landscape design, species selection. She's been a critical partner in helping us identify the appropriate species to plant throughout the states. She is also the co-writer of the original Urban Tree Carbon Calculator, which was the tool that the Air Resources Board originally used to capture greenhouse gases in the urban greening and urban forestry space. She works with me on another element of California Relief's mission, which is our grants program. So we are actually a grants administrator, and we do provide technical assistance and grants to nonprofit organizations throughout California. So today we're gonna switch off and guiding you through some tips on the urban greening elements. Right now though, I wanna provide an opportunity for my colleagues at Climate Resolve to tell you a little about themselves.
Thanks, Chuck. So I'm Bryn Lindblad. I'm Climate Resolve's Deputy Director, and you'll be hearing shortly from my colleague, Natalie Hernandez, Climate Resolve's Associate Director of Climate Planning and Resilience. So a bit about us, Climate Resolve, we are a nonprofit based in Los Angeles. We believe that climate change is a big global problem, but that many of the solutions to it are local. And so we focus on making climate change relatable on a scale that California communities can react to, can act on. And so we seek out opportunities to not only reduce harms, but also to improve lives and empower people. So we work on policy and legislative issues at the state and local levels, such as advocating for funding to help people bike or walk or take public transit in their neighborhoods. We also work on community projects, such as getting stormwater designs to capture rainwater and installing roofing and other surface designs that reduce urban heat. And we do a good amount of outreach and research on behalf of utility companies also, such as LA Department of Water and Power and Southern California Edison, to make their rebates and resources more accessible to communities. And lastly, we do some technical assistance work for some of the state's climate investment programs, which is why I'm here talking to you today. Next slide, please. So we're going to start by looking at a little bit of scoring overview in the program. But before I dive into that, I would like to ask our participants in the webinar today to turn to the chat and let us know if you've applied to the AHSC program before, so a yes or a no. And then if you're considering applying in this upcoming round 6, and let's say that on a scale of 1 to 10. So 10, you're really likely to apply this year. So yes or no, whether you've applied in the past, and then a scale of 1 to 10, 10 really likely you're going to apply this year. I'm just trying to get a sense of who we're talking to today. Okay, thank you for those responses coming in. All right, a lot of people really likely to apply, and that's great to hear. So for those of you applying, maybe you know AHSC is a very competitive program. And so if you're going for this funding, we really want you to be in it to win it, and do your best to get your application scored with as many points as possible. So that's why we're here, to help you figure out how to rack up those points. And there are a lot of different scoring categories that you need to make sure you're crossing your T's and dotting your I's and not forgetting about, not neglecting any of those sections. But we don't want it to overwhelm you either. So just make sure you're getting to it all, and I think you'll do a great job. So if I could have the next slide, please. Okay, so this is a little look at where the application points are coming from. This is the quantitative scoring section, and most of these points are about how much greenhouse gas emissions are reduced by reducing the amount that people drive. And that's not something we're talking about today. That was covered in a previous webinar on GHG quantifications. But today we're talking about 3 small sections of the application. And so the first you see here is the urban greening part. And this is scored quantitatively. And I want you to also be aware that urban greening is a threshold requirement. And so in order to be eligible for funds from the AHSC program, your project does need to have at least 2 urban greening features with dedicated maintenance for at least 2 years. And Chuck will get into that in a bit, but just want to let you know these 2 points in round 4 of the program, all of the awarded projects got both of these 2 points. So I think you should be seeing them as sort of necessary points for you to get, and don't want to leave those on the table. But that should be doable, and Chuck will get into that shortly. I'll get the next slide, please. The other 2 sections that we're going to talk about today are part of the narrative-based scoring, and there's a total of 15 points from the narrative. We're talking about 5 of those today. So the climate resiliency and air pollution exposure sections, and Natalie's going to talk to you about those in a little bit. But just want to give you a sense of sort of how many points we're looking at. So the climate resiliency is 3 points, and the air pollution is 2 points. Again, kind of looking back at past awarded projects in round 4, we saw that the winning projects got like 3.7 out of these 5 points. So there's a little more of an opportunity there to be like setting yourself apart from some projects that aren't getting full points here. So if we compare that, those awarded projects got, like I said, 3.68. The non-awarded projects were closer down to 2 points. And yeah, I think that is all I was going to say about this point. Next section, please. Next slide. Lastly, before we get into these 3 sections of the application, just want to kind of say there's a reason why we are covering all 3 of these together, because there's a lot of overlap and co-benefits between these sections. So, a lot of benefits for public health and saving the city money in the long run, for example, by mitigating extreme weather and disasters or flooding events. You can sort of do some preventative work there to save in the long run. And so you will notice that the strategies in these 3 topics are pretty complementary. More trees, more shade structures, traffic reducing infrastructure. All of these features also function to help create more livable, sustainable communities, which can make that infill affordable housing more appealing to residents around, and sort of give you a smoother process of getting the project built. So that's the sort of intro. I'm going to hand it over to Chuck now, who will dive into the urban greening section of the application.
Thank you so much, Bryn. Really appreciate that. So the first place that we're going to focus on is urban greening, and go through a couple of examples. And one of the things that I do want to mention is, even though we'll be spending just a portion of this webinar on the urban greening, there is a publication that we produced last year, especially for AHSC applicants. During the webinar today, we will post a link to it in the chat so that you'll be able to access that from Enterprise's website, and then I'll also reference it again later on. But I think the first thing we want to do right now is just identify, what are we talking about when we say urban greening? So it is defined in the AHSC guidelines in the appendix. And I posted it here because, as you can see, what we're really talking about is the nature-based infrastructure of your project and nature-based solutions. So the Strategic Growth Council is very clear to incorporate in words like greenscaped pedestrian and bicycle trails, making sure we're talking about urban trees, green alleys, and a variety of other natural infrastructure that contributes to your project. So we'll talk more about the what AHSC and Strategic Growth Council are looking for in urban greening, but I thought it was important first to just give an overall sense of what we're saying when we're defining urban greening. What we're going to do now, real quick, is go through what I like to think of as a three-step process that we use as technical assistance providers to AHSC applicants in identifying what we're looking for in your urban greening elements by first assessing the geography. And what I've done here is identified 3 mapping tools that we like to use to really look at what the geography of the project is that can help us identify what the needs are in the community and ultimately what urban greening features we're going to be putting in. So you can see here on the screen that the first one I've identified is CalEnviroScreen 3.0. This was developed by the state a couple years ago through statute, and this has been a guiding tool for not only the HSC program, but GGR programs across California. And what this does is uses a set of environmental indicators developed by the state to assign a score to where the project is located and where it falls on the spectrum of disadvantaged or severely disadvantaged communities in California. The higher in the percentage bracket the project is, the more disadvantaged the area is. So what I've done here is just take a snapshot of a project that we did work on last year in the area of McFarland, and this will be a reference point throughout the webinar for my co-presenters. But one of the reasons that we picked this project is it gives a good snapshot of these indicators, some of which are required to be calculated and identified in your application, which Natalie will talk later on about. But overall, it gives the applicant an idea of what they're looking at in terms of what this community is facing as you're considering what your urban greening elements are going to be. So you can see here you have an opportunity to look at the ozone, particulate matter, and this can help you identify whether or not this community needs shade trees, whether what's the asthma rate, et cetera. So this is a good starting point. The other map that I really like to use, pretty straightforward, it's Google Map. And the reason that I like to use that map is that when you apply your radius of where your project's located per the AHSC guidelines, you're able to just get a snapshot of what are the green features or lack thereof within the community that you're seeking to serve. This could be identifying where's the nearest place to get fresh produce, where's the nearest grocery store, where's the nearest park in relation to where your project's located. If there's a trail, is it shaded? If there's bus stops, are they shaded? So it really gives you a good opportunity to evaluate again what the needs may be for the community. And then finally, CalAdapt is a third tool, which I'm going to leave to my colleagues at Climate Resolve later on, but I did want to highlight it here because we'll go into more depth of detail on that. The second step is that once you've looked at those overview geographic features, you can start to evaluate what the community needs are based on what you've assessed from those maps. So here's just a handful of examples, some of which I've already mentioned. In the case of the Central Valley, there's a strong likelihood there's going to be extreme heat issues, and we're going to get into extreme heat in much more detail later on in the webinar. But that's one example. Access to fresh produce, that's increasingly important, especially when we're talking about disadvantaged communities and low-income communities. Stormwater management, as we know, flash flooding is increasingly becoming an element of California due to climate change. And so that's another feature that urban greening elements can mitigate for. And then again, another example, just walking and biking paths. Are they shaded? Are they accessible? Are they something the community is going to want to use? And what can your project do to help shape or improve those areas? So once you've established what the community needs are, you can move on to step 3, which is identifying what you want your urban greening elements to be. And we're going to go through this in a little more detail, but I want to just provide a couple of examples right now that are again featured in the publication that I believe Alejandro just linked to a couple of minutes ago. Thank you for doing that. What I wanted to do here was just identify some of the most popular features that are common in AHCC applications. Shade trees, they're almost always a given around an affordable housing structure. They provide numerous co-benefits. Colleen's going to talk a little bit about that. again, when we're talking about fresh produce, community gardens can be a great outlet for the residents in an affordable housing unit. And then greenscape trails. And I really do want to focus on the greenscape. You can see the picture here. This isn't just a trail that is running from point A to B. You can see there's a lot of shade here, well maintained, and that's what makes it a more of an amenity for the community that you're serving. So with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to my colleague at Urban Ecos, Colleen Ravden, who's going to provide a little more depth of detail.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks, Chuck. So I get to take it from the theoretical and down into the nitty-gritty on the ground and just talk through some practical examples. So, and give some practical advice too. I think we've got a lot of different kinds of people on this call looking through the names. So some of you are developers or architects or landscape architects. And so thinking through the site design is old hat to you, but I wanted to talk about my process for everybody else and just to sort of give a refresher on how we might think about it from an urban greening perspective. So my first piece of advice is please start early when you're thinking about your urban greening elements. We've had a couple of projects come to us looking for advice on how to accommodate urban greening when they've already reached the construction document stage. And at that point, any changes that are going to be made are very expensive, very hard to do. You're not going to have very interesting components that you can add. So the earlier you start to think about this in your site design process, the better off you are. And so this is the McFarland example that Chuck mentioned earlier. And zoomed in at the site scale, you have a completely blank slate. There's not a speck of anything on that site. That's the red box there. It's the Central Valley, so it's flat as a pancake. But if I start to zoom out a bit and look at the larger scale around it, one of the things that I notice is to the west, that is in the direction that the prevailing wind is going to come from, I see agricultural fields. So I start to think, okay, if the wind is going to be blowing from that direction, at times of the year, it's going to be blowing dust. At other times of the year, it's going to be blowing pesticides and fertilizers into my site. So one of my first ideas might be to plant some trees along that western side to, one more, Chuck, sorry, I forgot which one came first. Some trees along my western side to help block that wind and block that particulate matter. And I also will think, of course, that in this part of California in the summer, or pretty much 9 months of the year, it's going to be extremely hot. And so particularly at the later parts of the day, when the sun is coming from the west, it will be shining on my buildings and it will be extremely unpleasant there. So thinking both of the wind and the sun, that wall of trees that I might plant would be a really successful way to fend off those two environmental challenges. If I'm interested in having a community garden on my project, then I need to think about that early also, because obviously it has to go to the south side of the buildings. It can't be shaded by the structures that are going to be placed on the site. So I want to have the siting of my community garden as early in the project as I can to make sure that it's getting as much sun as it needs. And I might look at the slope of the site. Is there a place where my arrow went crazy for some reason. It's not meant to be pointing right at the church. It's meant to be pointing towards the top right corner there. But regardless, looking at the way that the slope, that the water would move across the site, is there a place that's particularly sensible for a bioretention feature or some kind of stormwater feature? And then the last thing that I might look at is what's in the surrounding areas. So Chuck mentioned, for instance, are there parks on the site? So if I look in the relative radius that's given to me by the guidelines, are there green areas that I could connect my site to, that I could work with the city to improve the connectivity through, again, through greenscape trails? And so the earlier that you start to think about all of these things, the more likely you're going to be able to incorporate them in a creative way and in a cost-effective way and in a way that actually does the most good. So next slide, Chuck. So as Chuck mentioned, I think it's likely that most, if not all, projects are going to incorporate shade trees into their design. And the reasons for this are, for one, they're cost effective. They also provide us an enormous amount of what we call ecosystem services. And a lot of these ecosystem services are relevant to the climate resiliency and the air pollution mitigation that my colleagues will talk about later. So, but listen up at this part, because I can help you think about how these trees provide these ecosystem services to help you craft your narrative. So trees help us by reducing greenhouse gases. They pull carbon dioxide out of the air. They help us reduce energy use by strategically shading buildings and reducing the amount of energy that's required for cooling. When they do that, they reduce the amount of energy required at the power plant level, which also reduces greenhouse gases and also reduces the air pollutants that are created when fossil fuels are burned to create electricity. And that sounds like it's so far down the path, indirect benefits, that it wouldn't be that significant, but it really adds up in terms of energy conservation, especially in the hottest parts of California. Trees can also help us with stormwater management. So incorporating shade trees is definitely a great idea, but all of those benefits are associated with the size of the tree. So oftentimes we might see people cramming little tiny trees onto the site and hoping that that is sufficient. But I will say the trees absolutely have to be big enough in order to provide those benefits. So my middle rule there is bigger is better. The biggest tree that you can fit onto the site is going to be the one that provides the greatest amount of benefits. We also would like to plant trees to shade buildings and pavements. And that will help us with reducing the urban heat island impact, as well as I said, reducing energy consumption. And finally, we would like to encourage you to plant a diversity of species. We've seen in recent years in California a variety of new devastating pests, and I think we can anticipate them considering the global market. We can anticipate that there will always be new pests that attack new species. So the wider and the more diverse our palette can be of trees, the more likely we are going to be to have success and to have a healthy ecosystem there. And so my last slide is just a quick list of the trees that we like and the trees that we don't like. And it's not that these specific specimens are critical, but it's that I wanted to give you the gist of the kind of species that we're looking for. Trees we like, as I said, are big. It's often valuable to have a mix of deciduous and evergreen. And it looks like in the comments, a conversation is going on about native versus non-native. And so I'm going to take 1 second and address that, which is in urban settings, we do not have a native environment. We have a hotter, drier, more soil compacted, far more polluted situation. So I always love to look first for a native species that is relevant. But at the same time, we also want to acknowledge that we don't have a native environment. And so native species are not always our #1 choice. So on the list here, we have some species that are native and some that are not. And then the trees that we don't love so much tend to be the ones that are small and pretty and delicate and can fit anywhere, but at the same time, again, are providing really almost negligible benefits. And finally, of course, palm trees, which aren't even palms, and for the most part cannot be paid for with state grant funding because they do not provide the benefits that we're looking for. That is my section.
Thank you so much, Colleen. So a couple more just quick points here. One of the things that we wanted to remind you of is that the urban green elements are required. There's 2 that are required. A common point of confusion is the scoring, which is we want to make sure that everyone is aware that you do not get 1 point for each urban greening element. Those points or the urban greening elements are required. Your points come from how much you're spending on those 2 urban greening elements. So if you're spending over $100,000 but under $200,000 for your 2 distinct urban greening elements, you're getting 1 point. If you've gone over 200,000, that's when you accrue the 2 points. But the urban greening elements 2 are required regardless. Another point to remember, and this is a really important one because this has come in the later rounds of the AHSC application, is that Strategic Growth Council did amend the urban greening definition recently to allow for community gardens not to have to be publicly accessible. They just need to be accessible to the residents of the affordable housing development. And this is significant because, as you know, if a development has gates or otherwise is restricted just to the residents, then that public accessibility component doesn't apply. Thank you to Strategic Growth Council for allowing for this kind of flexibility, which has then allowed for more community gardens to be integrated into the process. And then finally, you'll see here we say, don't sweat the small stuff. As Bryn mentioned earlier, the application does have a lot of elements to it that need to be completed. The urban greening is really the low-hanging fruit. And you'll see here what we've done is posted the 2 areas within the application that apply to the urban greening element, which is identifying what the 2 elements are and then the total cost of the project. So this is a real opportunity to not only benefit the community that you're serving through your project, but also picking up those key critical 2 points that, as Bryn mentioned, are typically connected to successful applications. And finally, I have lost control here and it's back. Finally, as you know, I mentioned a document that we put together last year. It's Urban Forest and Urban Greening, a guide to green infrastructure for AHSC applicants. Much of what we've talked about today can be found and further explored within this document. Also, we've linked to partners that can be part of your process at the local level, whether those are the urban forestry groups that I discussed earlier, local conservation corps, which can also develop or can contribute to your workforce development part of the application, local land trusts if you're planning on doing parks or community green space. All these are great partners at the local level. We also give examples of projects that have been successful in integrating urban greening features into their AHSC application and additional resources that we've covered today. So I believe Alejandro just connected the link again in the chat. Thank you so much. And with that, we'll be happy to
Go for it, Natalie.
This is Natalie, and I'm so sorry that I might adjust the screen here. I don't know what exactly happened.
That's
so
fine.
I will,
Go ahead.
yeah, I'm wondering what happened. Okay, well, I will keep us moving along, and I apologize if I kind of run through this. I know we want to have time for some questions at the end. But thanks, Chuck. I'll go over tips on how to get the full 3 points available for the climate resiliency section. And before I jump into this section, can I ask participants to type into the chat what climate impacts might your project area be dealing with that you know about? Here are some things to take into account when thinking about climate resilience. We know communities are increasingly being hit harder with the impacts of extreme weather events like droughts, sea level rise, flooding, wildfires, or heat waves. We also know that communities need to build preparedness through social networks as well as physical infrastructure. Therefore, climate resilience is knowing the impacts and creating strategies to be prepared and withstand those impacts. There are 2 overarching steps in addressing climate resilience in the AHSC application. The first overarching step is assessing the climate impacts, and there are 4 actions that should happen concurrently. One action is using the state's climate adaptation assessment matrix on the SGC website as a guide. The matrix asks applicants to report out data on 4 types of climate impacts: heat, precipitation changes, sea level rise, inland flooding, and wildfire. It's important to fill out as much of the matrix as possible, but just know that not all climate impacts are applicable to your area. For example, if you're more inland, your projects would not have to report sea level rise. Another action is obtaining data for the matrix. You can use climate data via a climate assessment from your local government or by using caladapt.org. Most applicants opt to use CalAdapt since it's the state's recognized data hub and it's easy to find the information following the matrix instructions. For example, I'll walk through a demo of how to get a number of extreme heat days for the McFarland area. This is the extreme heat days and warm nights tool and what it looks like on the CalAdapt website. We'll compare extreme heat days in McFarland for historical and end of century RCP 4.5 projections. The first thing you do is put in the project location by clicking on the change button on the left side of the screen. Once you click on that location change button, your screen will be redirected and you'll type in the project location into the address box, which in this case is for a project in McFarland. Then leave the default CalAdapt geographic boundary to measure climate impacts, which is 1/16 of a grid or approximately 6 by 6 kilometers, and then click update. Here you'll see that the threshold temperature for McFarland is 106 degrees, 106.1 degrees, which means that any day over that percentile, that temperature, is considered an extreme heat day in McFarland. So over 106.1 degrees is actually very hot. And that temperature changes is based on the type of region that one would live in California. Then the two emission scenarios of representative concentration pathways, or RCP, are given 4.5 and 8.5. The 4.5 RCP is a scenario in which global GHG emissions decline after 2040, whereas the 8.5 describes a scenario in which global emissions continue to increase over the next century, also known as continuing business as usual. The climate impacts projected in the 4.5 RCP are less dramatic than those in the 8.5 RCP. You'll use the buttons on the left side of the screen to toggle and view different projections of each RCP. And then this is the timeline part where right now we're choosing the 4.5 RCP, which is the less dramatic projection. And outlined in red, you'll be asked to report the number of annual average extreme heat days over time. So you'll see on the screen that the default historical timeline shows that McFarland has had an annual average of 4 extreme heat days. And then you'll toggle the slider on the right to determine the projected extreme heat days for mid-century and end of century. And in this case, we're looking at the number of extreme heat days towards the end of century, where they're projected to be an annual of 29 days over 106.1 degrees in McFarland. So I just want to emphasize that you should kind of write this data into the narrative. I've posted it up here on the screen and want to emphasize that this is a key point about heat in McFarland changing over time, and that this data makes a case for why there should be designs in place to adapt, or else residents can suffer from heat exhaustion, dehydration, and heat strokes. Another place to reference if you need help contextualizing your climate impacts in your narrative and understanding the bigger picture is going to look at the 4th Climate Change Assessment regional reports for your area. And then lastly, you should be connecting the projects with local planning documents if available. For example, by 2022, each of the jurisdictions will be required to address climate adaptation in a local planning document. So make sure to coordinate with city staff on this. And then this is the fun or more creative part of this process for how you as a developer, local government staff, or CBO get to influence the design of the project. I want to reiterate the need for the narrative and the matrix to connect and reinforce each other and the strategies. So in McFarland, extreme heat was a big concern. And some of the strategies might be to install a bus shelter along with trees or make the roof on your building have reflective cooling materials. Other example strategy designs are bioswales for stormwater capture and to prevent flooding. Then with precipitation changes and to adapt to long period of drought, we suggest water efficient fixtures in the affordable housing development. And for wildfire prone areas, creating defensible space is important. Again, these are just some examples and there's more information in our tip sheet linked in the slides, and we'll also drop it into the chat box. The next section that I'll go over is how to put forth an application to get the full 2 points for air pollution mitigation in the narrative. As Chuck mentioned, there's a step that includes Cal and Biro screen, and in Cal Enviro Screen, you're actually required to report 4 categories: the toxic releases, diesel, PM 2.5, and traffic density. If you can, investigate the source of air pollution to show that you have an understanding of the neighborhood. For example, your project might be near freeways or high traffic roadways. So you can look at the number of vehicles that go by on these roads by investigating Caltrans data. Then in the narrative, you might want to describe the harm from this air pollution if unmitigated. For example, residents may be more prone to respiratory disease if there are no design strategies incorporated into your project. For strategies, the AHSC program is really looking to what projects can do to reduce air pollution and exposure to it. So these are just a few examples. The first is a roundabout, which calms traffic in the area. And studies show that roundabouts can reduce localized pollutants concentrations by 20% or more compared to intersections that force stop and go accelerations. Then another example is a vegetation barrier between the project and a high traffic roadway. Studies show trees and vegetation assist in turbulence and dispersion of up to 22% of near roadway pollution when strategically placed to mimic a solid barrier. And even if you don't have a wall barrier of vegetation, planting a good amount of trees can absorb pollutants and traps particulate matter. So make sure to work with California Relief on your tree selection to do this. Another strategy is using high efficiency air filtration, MERV 14 or higher. Air filtration devices installed on an HVAC air intake system remove 80 to 90% of indoor particulate matter. And one important component is identifying who will also replace the MERV filters to ensure for maintenance and regular inspections. And lastly, another strategy is designing the building to have corridors characterized by varying shapes, heights, and open spaces to encourage airflow between the housing units. Now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Bryn Lindblad, to wrap up.
Thanks, Natalie. Yeah, so to kind of recap the recipe Natalie's laid out for those 2 sections on climate resilience and air pollution, we say first go get the data, look at sort of what are the conditions that environment is facing or expecting, and then kind of internalize that process. Why does that matter? And lastly, get at what sort of strategies your project is going to do to address those conditions. We're here to kind of make sure you're not skipping any of those steps, sort of hitting all parts of the recipe. Let's see. I want to just recap. This is where the points for all the points in the application come from. For those of you who are familiar with earlier rounds of the AHSC program, you'll note there's been some changes. Some things that used to be competitive scoring criteria have now become threshold requirements. And other areas that used to be scored in a more subjective way have become more specific on what you need to get those points. So the 3 sections we talked about today, urban greening, climate resilience, and air pollution, are some of the newer sections. And they will no doubt continue to evolve a bit from round to round, all sort of with the aim of making them more user-friendly for you and to be uplifting current best practices. So I would say sort of watching how this program has evolved, the AHSC program I think tries to strike a balance between not having you program applicants jump through too many difficult hoops, but yet trying to get the most bang for the buck, the most sort of multi-benefit impact out of the state dollars whenever there's an opportunity to do so. Lastly, just want to say, you know, the sections we talked about today, if you approach them in a robust or thoughtful way, you can be getting sort of spillover points in other sections too, such as community benefits and workforce development. And want to stress that the earlier on you start in your planning process to think about these elements, the more opportunity there is to do some really neat stuff. So we'll turn to Q&A soon. You'll have a chance to chat your questions in the chat box. But just before we get there, want you to feel convinced that the 7 points we talked about today are attainable and that we're equipping you with the resources to go out and get those 7 points. And this team of technical assistance providers is not going anywhere. All of the speakers here today are part of an ongoing technical assistance team that's available for you to reach out to with any questions you might have starting today. We'll give you our contact information in a moment. But first, I just briefly want to make sure you're clear on the program, the timeline for the program. So this is the anticipated program timeline that the Strategic Growth Council will follow. It's an annual grant cycle. Every November, the notice of available funding comes out. And then you get to work on your application over Christmas, and it's due, the application is due in the early February. But before the NOFA is released here over the summer, they'll put out some draft guidelines, and then those will get adopted around October. And shortly thereafter, the NOFA comes out, and you get to start working on your application. Next slide, please. And this is our recommendation for the timeline that you should be following in order to get your applications ready and in good shape come early February. So as we've said, sort of the sooner you start thinking about these sections, the better your chances are at being able to incorporate some neat community serving elements. And especially when a public sector partner is involved, that's not something that you want to leave for the last minute. So we are available to help you start thinking through these sections already now. And then this fall, keep your eyes out for when you can apply to be a technical assistance recipient. And we'll be certain to have some more ongoing review of your progress on the application then. So our technical assistance team, we offer red line edits once you're further along in a draft. But most of all, we'd like to just talk to you early when you're scoping out your project elements. So we'd encourage you really to not wait until it's too late, and don't be shy. We're here to be a resource to you. Here you have our contact information from the speakers today, as well as Shep, who's the program contact at Strategic Growth Council. And at that, we'll turn it over and start trying to answer some of the questions that you might be putting in the chat box. So can I ask Chase, have you been looking at the chat box? Any questions that we should take on first?
Yeah, I mean, we've been answering a few in the chat. One statement that came up, it said, Nathan says that Caltrans has data for state highways, but not other roads. Are there other good resources to analyze road use in local projects?
Yeah, I think that's speaking to the slide Natalie presented when you're looking at the sources of local air pollution. You know, I think your major sources are going to be those bigger roads. So that looking at the Caltrans data is probably your largest source of the local air pollutants. Sometimes if a local like active transportation plan has been done, you'll have traffic volumes that you can find in there. But yeah, there's not necessarily a comprehensive database out there for local roads traffic volumes.
Cool. Thank you.
This is Alejandro. Let me just add to that really quickly. I think if you have a project in a locality with a public health department, you might try to reach out to them. For example, in LA County, Department of Public Health is actively involved on the AHSC applications. So I would suggest reaching out to your local public health department, as they may have this data as well.
Good tip.
And then somebody's asking if there is a location for all of the slides from the AHSC web meetings in one place.
This is Alejandro. So I can answer that in two ways. One, as I mentioned previously, all the webinar recordings will be on the SGC website. So if you currently go there, there's only one of them right now, but eventually they'll be up there at sgc.ca.gov. And then in addition to that, feel free to email me. As you see on my contacts is here on this slide. I can send you the presentation slides if you'd like as well.
Earlier on, somebody had asked about, and people seemed interested in knowing a little bit more about tree selection. So are there like any particular resources that you would direct people to as they're trying to decide what kind of vegetation they want to put in their projects?
Well, this is Chuck, and I'll also let my colleague Kalaine chime in. There are best practices guides that are available. I want to say that in the urban greening section, or in the appendix for the AHSC application, we've seen some of those recess connected before in terms of best management practices, which are adopted by CAL FIRE and the Natural Resources Agency, and Tree Select. And then I'm sure there's a couple others that I'm missing. Kalaine, you want to help me out?
I'm sorry, I had muted in the wrong direction, so I actually missed the question.
Guides for species selection.
I think you covered the answer pretty well. I would also say, depending on your city, some of the nonprofits in the different cities also have really good selection tools. I'd say anywhere in the Central Valley, I really like the Sacramento Tree Foundation's shade tree tool. Tree People also does a good job. Friends of the Urban Forest in San Francisco. So I would turn to your nonprofits, would be a good place to start with that. But as somebody else mentioned in the comments, there are all kinds of layers of restrictions on you. So, you know, what we might recommend might not be allowed by your city, though that we've worked pretty hard to make our list of preferred trees ones that are widely acceptable, that aren't invasive or too messy or things like that. But I think your nonprofits are really a great place to start.
And I think in the resource that we put up linked to a couple times, we actually linked to a couple of the items that we identified today. In addition, California Relief did a publication called Trees for the 21st Century, which definitely has those links. And so you can contact Kalaine or myself to get a copy of that. And I also want to speak to a question that I did see come up. It wasn't so much a question as a statement that talked about how sometimes within certain local governments or cities, the species that are allowed by the city can be very limiting, and therefore the choices and the scope can be very narrow. I just want to say that I think it's been our experience, and Kalaine, please chime in here, is that you can always go to the city and see if they can add on the species that you want to include. And we have had certainly plenty of back and forth with some of our grantees in the Cal Relief Program in terms of the species that the state wants to fund and the species that the city wants to see planted. And there can be some give and take there. So Kalaine, anything to add there?
No, I agree. The cities usually, oftentimes those lists are pretty old, and we've had success in just asking for things to be added to it.
Great. I'm seeing here a good tip from one of our participants, noting that the MERV 14 filters are quite large, so they need to be designed into the building from the start. You know, again, this kind of, the earlier you start thinking about incorporating these elements, the more possible it is.
And then we have a question that is, do you anticipate that there might be new filtration and hydration standards due to COVID-19?
That's a good question. I can speak to our experience in LA trying to get more hydration stations out there. We've been leaning towards designs that have the dispenser that's kind of up in an enclosed area so people can't be touching the sort of the spout that's releasing the water. So that would be a tip, I would say. Look for a model like that. But I haven't heard of like new health department standards coming down.
Alejandro, can we go back quickly? Kalaine, you mentioned this earlier on in the conversation about native vegetation. I didn't know if you wanted to add anything to that conversation.
Thanks, Alejandro. I actually am happy to do that because it's hard to follow the comments while you're talking, and so I wanted to throw my 2 cents out there, but I'm glad to maybe be able to add on a little bit. So as I said, there are so many constraints around trees in terms of what can be successful in cities. Cities are hotter and they're drier and they have bad soil and they have air pollution from cars, and they can't be messy because you can't plant trees with messy fruit that lands on the sidewalk that gets tracked into businesses, and they can't have fragile limbs because they might fall on people and cars. We want to be sure they're pest resistant as much as possible, because if a wave of pests comes through and destroys them all, we'll have lost our entire investment. You can't plant big trees under power lines. You can't, anyway, the list of constraints is enormous. And so if we add native species as a ruling constraint, we would probably be left with nothing. Also, we have to consider the fact that in much of the San Joaquin Central Valley, along the coast, there actually were really few to no trees. So I think it's interesting, and I always like the challenge of trying to add native tree species to a project where we can, but I don't think we want to limit ourselves to that. I think where we can bring a lot of exciting native vegetation into a project is one layer down. So the smaller trees that are more like shrubs, the shrubs themselves, ground covers, native grasses, wildflowers that are native that would support native pollinator species. So I'm not turning anybody off from planting native trees, but you can't put a California coast live oak in front of everyone's house. So let's be as creative as we can, recognizing that the urban environment is a difficult one. And from a water perspective, it's going to be those things in the next level down, like the flowers and the grass, like lawns and shrubs that would probably be our big water drains anyway. So, and I should also say, on all of our lists, we are only providing you with trees that are water smart, let's call them that are very low, and in occasional cases, moderate water users. And most of the funding in California, again, will not pay for trees that require substantial amounts of water. So the water component is something that we can definitely, we look to other parts of the world that are as dry as California, Australia, the Mediterranean, for species that will survive under the water challenge conditions that we have now.
Great, thanks, Kalaine. And we have about a minute left, so we'll just wait to see if there's any last minute, literally, chat box questions. If not, as I said, we'll send out a follow-up email with the questions from the chat, as well as the sources, the multiple sources that have been linked in the chat box, the presentation slides, and the recording of this webinar. Well, with that, it is 11:30. Thank you all for your participation. Once again, please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. I'm going to save today's chat and then end the recording, and hope that the rest of you have a good day. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.
Thanks everyone for joining.
Bye.